For more, I'm joined by Dahlia. She's a political analyst and fellow at the Century Foundation and author of the new book, The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel. She joins me from Tel Aviv. Appreciate you doing so. What is your read on the negotiations as they stand, the willingness of each side to make a deal, especially in light of this news just in the last few minutes that Palestinians are being told by the IDF to move out of eastern Rafah, which could be the start of something or it could be a negotiating tactic?
I think we have to look beyond the question of negotiating tactic with relation to Rafah and the hostage negotiation deals. The threat of Rafah has been hanging over everybody for months now, and it could have conceivably been seen as a negotiating tactic, but Israel has been preparing very, very significantly for an invasion. And the governing coalition, the original governing coalition led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, they've been saying over and over again that this is an absolute must, building up the case. And it seems that the government has prioritized going into Rafah. It's the fact that they're beginning it with an evacuation of the eastern neighborhoods of Rafah is probably meant to placate to some level the panic around the world of what would happen with a full-out invasion. But it does seem that that is taking precedence over the kinds of concessions that would be needed to be made to finalize the hostage deal.
Right.
And it seems that we've seen these rounds of negotiations for the hostage deal that has collapsed every time. Hamas also bears responsibility, of course, because Hamas has not accepted what the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has said were very generous terms that Israel has agreed to over time with the hostage negotiations, and the two sides are barricaded into their positions.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, do you think Benjamin Netanyahu wanted a ceasefire before going into Rafah? Because there are some, even in Israel, who think he doesn't, and certainly he has members of his own government who think a Rafah invasion is more important than a deal. Do you think that he was always going to do that?
Well, there's no way to divine what's going on inside Mr. Netanyahu's head. In fact, because we're not there. However, put it this way, there was a very clear threat on the part of his far-right ultra-nationalist coalition partners to leave the government if Israel did not go into Rafah, and they were haranguing the government all the time, including through tweets, saying that the kinds of deal that seemed to be shaping up with Hamas would represent a capitulation and that they would leave the government. That would most likely lead to new elections. And Netanyahu, of course, does want to stay in power. That's the circumstantial evidence for the sense that Netanyahu would prefer to continue with the Rafah operation rather than reach a hostage deal. We can't be inside his head, but there's another problem, and that's that the Israeli public views, Mr. Netanyahu's decision-making as highly influenced by those personal political considerations about keeping his coalition together and keeping himself in power. And that's a significant problem when the population doesn't trust his motivations.
Dig into that a little deeper, because I was going to ask you about that next anyway. We see the demonstrations in Israel calling for a deal. Give us a sense of the broader Israeli public opinion on deals, ceasefire, what compromises should or should not be made.
Well, the Israeli public is not in the position of being the negotiator. And I think that it's true that there are some people who would say complete end to the war is too high a price to pay. But those aside, the majority of Israelis are desperate to see a hostage release agreement. And that is compounded by what has always been a lack of trust in Netanyahu since the beginning of this war. His ratings and his government's ratings have plunged. And what we're seeing over recent weeks is a very striking rise in surveys in the portion of people who don't believe what Mr. Netanyahu has been promising, this slogan of a total victory. Over 60% in one survey by the public broadcaster, commissioned by the public broadcaster Khan News. Nearly 2/3 of Israelis don't believe that Israel is just one step away from total victory.
Wow.
So I think the total picture is that Israelis want the hostages back. They no longer believe that any one move, including the Rafah operation, will lead to this total victory. They are well aware that without an alternative to Hamas or a longer-term political horizon, at the very least for the day after the war, there is no particular endpoint to the war, and all the time the hostages are probably certainly suffering and probably dying in Hamas captivity. And so more of the public would prioritize hostage release at this point. but the government is not capitulating first and foremost to the Israeli public on this.
You raise a good point there in terms of the what next. There's still been so little discussion on any official level about that. What happens when this is over? I mean, the US still talks about a two-state solution. Netanyahu has explicitly said that's not happening on his watch. Settlements are growing, land occupied, and the positions taken by the government. Is a viable, contiguous Palestinian state even possible? Especially given what Israel has always called, facts on the ground.
I think anybody who lives in this region and has been observing closely the developments in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Israel's occupation and de facto annexation over time has come to the conclusion long before this war began that the two-state solution in the sense of an independent, sovereign, contiguous Palestinian state would be extremely hard to achieve. And of course, it has only gotten more so. It's not entirely impossible, although I personally do think that the nature of those two states would need to be reconstituted for a different kind of two states in an open, more confederated relationship, because there's no way to have complete separation at this point. But any sort of agreed political resolution right now is extremely difficult to achieve under this Israeli government. They don't want anything that the Palestinians would agree to. Now, that doesn't mean it's entirely impossible, but it will require massive, I think, a perfect storm of international involvement, including both incentives and pressure, probably from Western allies and Middle Eastern countries. And those countries will have to come together with a policy. Right now, I think the international community has been talking sternly and maybe even in an impassioned way about getting back to the two-state solution, although even that was in the first few months of the war, not so much recently. But this kind of talk can't rest on rhetoric. It has to be backed by policies, ideally coordinated policies that will involve some sort of political intervention. And there's talk of some sort of participation of other countries in security intervention as well in the long term. But those have to be part of a comprehensive vision. They can't be sort of piecemeal policies for the day after without thinking about the entire picture and the long term.
Yeah. And there has to be a willingness. Always great to get your analysis, Dahlia Scheindlin. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.